Election season is in full swing as the May 29th national and provincial elections draw closer. Leaders of political parties have been crisscrossing the country. And of course, among their potential voter targets are the country's diverse religious groupings. So we're going to be shining a spotlight now on how contemporary parliamentary parties in South Africa have engaged with religion throughout their history and just how a political party uses religion as a political strategy. So for more on this, I'm going to be joined virtually by David Jeffery-Schwikkard, who is a PhD candidate at King's College London. David, good morning and thank you for your time on the SABC at this hour.
Good morning and thank you for having me on your show.
David, for context's sake, perhaps you could speak to the extent that the historical route to statehood has affected our sense of national identity at large, given the political implications of racial, ethnic, religious and regional identities in South Africa.
Absolutely. So I think there are two things that are important to understand about the history of the apartheid state. The first is that its ideology was one of Christian nationalism. The state explicitly identified with a religion. And the second, of course, is that it tried to divide us into different groups. And so the liberation movement tried to counter this by proposing a united vision of one South Africa that is neutral between religions. And this is what we see in our constitution. The constitution doesn't identify with any one religion, and we relate to our religion through individual rights. That's how religion is framed in the constitution. And so we're protected even if we don't have a religion or regardless of which religion we have.
Well, David, thank you for setting that context, because religions have also been involved in nationalist politics. And I wonder what impact that has had on society at large. But also looking at, how faith-based organizations or religious parties ultimately have performed in South Africa during the election period in particular as well.
Yes. So I think our history of nationalist politics, the way that religion has been entwined with nationalism, means that the South African electorate is very reluctant to support politics that identify with one religion. And that's interesting because even though we have a very religious country, political parties that explicitly identify as religious tend to do very poorly. If you add the ACDP's performance with Al-Jamaah's performance at a national level, together at their best, they haven't got more than 2% of the vote. And one way of interpreting that is that the voters, even though they are very religious, don't really want our laws to be religious. And that, I think, relates to our history, that we have a history in which we're coming from a very oppressive state, and I think voters are very sensitive to that.
But David, as you're speaking, the issue of tolerance also comes up for me. I wonder at this point if you could speak to how tolerant we really are as a society, perhaps in accommodating, what is offered. What is offered in terms of religion in South Africa, even secular orientation, the observances, the practices, the performance of religious diversity. What have been your observations on that front then?
Yes, so I think in many ways South Africa is intolerant. I think we have to acknowledge that. But when it comes to religion, we're a surprisingly tolerant society. Religion isn't really politicized as an identity. And that comes from surveys of tolerance and religion in South Africa. The vast majority of South Africans either welcome or are indifferent to having people of different religions as their neighbors. And I think, as you said, there's an important element in which we perform diversity as a society. So, for example, if you attend an ANC event, the event will start with a litany of religious leaders doing prayers in order to sort of bless the proceedings. And that includes Christianity, but also Islam and Hinduism and Judaism. And I think what's interesting about that is those prayers are being done even if there aren't adherents to those religions in the audience. And so I think part of why those prayers are being done is, as you say, this performance of diversity. It's this embrace of just how diverse we are as a country.
And so speaking about performance, I wonder the impact that this is going to have, because I, at this point, want to then look at the major political opinion leaders in South Africa as a result. And where do traditional leaders or religious authorities then fall under that? Let's say even bringing media personalities, party leaders at large, scientists. What role does religiosity play in all of this?
So I think when you look at surveys of who South Africans trust in terms of institutions, what's really interesting is that the institutions that we trust the most are the media, including government media, so you can pat yourself on the back for that, but also government departments like the Department of Health. And what's interesting is those then are seen as not affiliated with any political party. I mean, obviously, the Department of Health is part of government, and that's part of politics, but the way people interact with the Department of Health is through doctors and nurses, and so on. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have religious leaders and politicians who are among the least trusted in our society. And so I think, again, we have something very interesting in South Africa, where we have a society that's very religious, but doesn't really trust religious leaders. And part of what comes out of my research with that is how people separate their religion from their one church that they're attending. That they might change church, they might recognize that church can be corrupt, but that's separate from their views on God and their relationship with their faith.
And so, David, on the back of that, I wonder if we could try to spotlight on some of the parties in South Africa, because, you know, there's a mix of religious rhetoric and a secular policy agenda by the ANC that's come through over the past century. I wonder if you could speak to some of your unearthings on that front. How has it evolved? Has it compared to previous elections and to this 2024 election campaign strategy? But let me also throw in the NP party with the NG Kerk. You've got Al Jamaa in terms of Islam, ATM, who's also come out to say that they're a faith-based organization. Talk to us a little bit more about your unearthings on that front.
Yeah, so I think the ANC has pursued a strategy for a very long time in which it embraces religious diversity in rhetoric and how it engages with communities, but its policies have always been very secular. So, for example, we as a country were one of the first countries to recognize same-sex marriage through the Civil Union Act. And so I think what's interesting when you see the ANC engaging with churches is that they'll go to church, they'll celebrate the church and the church's contribution to society, but they won't be making a promise that we will have more religious legislation or anything like that. That it's engaging with churches as part of a diverse society. And I think then comparing this election to previous elections, as I've said, explicitly religious parties do very poorly, and I would expect us to see more of that. But I'm interested in political parties that are using more religious rhetoric very, very astutely. So, for example, Herman Mashaba's party, I think, is very interesting in this regard. Herman Mashaba shows us his religion on a regular basis. On his Twitter, he posts prayers almost every day. And I'm interested to see how the electorate receives him, because he combines a mostly secular policy position with a quite religious public persona.
Well, David, thank you for your time on the SABC at this hour and for explaining your workings, your research, and of course some of the dynamics unfolding in our country.